Strategy of History by Lawrence Friedman, Oxford Press, 2013. Formulas, Myths, and Propaganda, page 321. Whereas Weber and Dewey represented distinctive strands of the liberal critique of Marxism, there was a more conservative critique developed by the so-called Italian school of Neo-Machiavellians. Notable among them were the Sicilian Gaetano Mosca, who held a number of academic and political positions within Italy during a long life, and German sociologist Robert Michels, who spent most of his career in Italy, and the Italian Vilfredo Pareto, who began his career in Italy but then decamped to Geneva. Their ideas developed as an explicit correction to expectations of a progressively more equal and democratic society, and were marked less by strategic considerations than by a keen sense of the limits of what strategy might achieve. They were part of a movement away from political economy and into sociology as explanations were sought for the less rational aspects of social behavior. They were described as the heirs of Machiavelli, not only because of the Italian link, but also because they took him to be a model of an unsentimental approach to the study of politics, accepting the harsh realities of its practice and refusing to take at face value the comforting rhetoric of its practitioners. The core proposition was that a minority would always rule over a majority. The key questions therefore revolved around the means by which the elite sustained its position and how it might be displaced. The most significant empirical work on the impact of organizational needs on democratic claims was undertaken by Robert Michels, a student of Weber's. As an active member of the German Social Democratic Party, Michels had come to recognize the importance of the party bureaucracy in shaping its goals and strategy. While nobody doubted that capitalist parties were non-democratic, whatever they might say about the will of the people, socialist parties posed a sharper test for the democratic principle because of their proclaimed egalitarianism. Michels' analysis fitted in perfectly with Weber's theories of bureaucratization. Unlike his radical student, however, Weber was content with the consequential loss of revolutionary elan. Concepts such as the genuine will of the people, he explained to Michels, have long since ceased to exist for me. They are fictitious notions. Michels' study of the pre-war SPD demonstrated how growth and electoral success drained the party of militancy. Organization becomes the vital essence of the party. So long as the party was growing, the leadership was content, reluctant to put the organization at risk by taking any bold steps that might challenge the state. As they developed an interest in their own self-perpetuation, Michels noted, quote, "From a means, organization becomes an end," end quote. Organization was demanding and complicated, required specialist skills. Those who knew how to manage finances, look after members, produce literature, and direct campaigns acquired superior knowledge and controlled both the form and content of communications. So long as they stayed united, the relatively incompetent masses had no chance to impose their will. Who says organization? Says oligarchy. This was Michels' iron law. Beyond this law and his consequential disillusionment with socialism, Michels did not offer much of a general theory. In this respect, Mosca was more important. His starting point was simple. In all political systems, at all times and places, there was a ruling class, a minority of influential persons to which management, willingly or unwillingly, the majority defer. Mosca considered rule by a single individual to be as unlikely as by the majority. This was because of the necessity of organization. Majorities were inherently disorganized, and individuals by definition lacked organization. So only minorities could stay organized, which meant that key political struggles must take place within the elite. To become preeminent, hard work and ambition made a difference. More so than a sense of justice and altruism. Most important were perspicacity, a ready intuition of individual and mass psychology, strength of will, and especially confidence in oneself. Changing circumstances influence the rise and fall of elites. Priests would fare best in a religious society and warriors in one at war. If a particular social force declined in importance, so would those who derived their power from it. Pareto followed closely on Mosca, not always, Mosca suggested, with full attribution. Trained in engineering and after a spell in industry, Pareto first made his name in economics and then in sociology. As an economist at the University of Lausanne, he worked in the neoclassical tradition. Here he followed Leon Walras, the father of general equilibrium theory, responsible for the proposition that if all other markets in an economy are in equilibrium, then any specific market must also be in equilibrium. In his 1885 book, Elements of Pure Economics, Walras proved this mathematically, thereby setting a precedent for economic theory that would be picked up enthusiastically in the middle of the next century, particularly in the United States. Pareto gave his name to two contributions. The Pareto principle suggested that 80% of effects came from about 20% of the causes. This rough rule of thumb indicated that a minority of inputs could be responsible for a disproportionate share of outputs, in itself a challenge to notions of equality. Secondly, and more substantively, he gave his name to the concept of Pareto efficiency, which also influenced later economic thought. In 1902, he published a critique of Marxism, which marked his move away from economics towards sociology. Pareto appreciated Marx's idea of class conflict and his hard-edged approach to the analysis of human behavior, but parted company on the belief that class conflict would be transcended through proletarian victory. The people might well believe that they were fighting for a great cause, and maybe the leaders did too. In practice, however, the elite would look after itself. Even in a collectivist society, there would still be conflict, for example, between intellectuals and non-intellectuals. One of Pareto's most important and influential themes, derived from his background in engineering and economics, was that of social equilibrium. He argued that societies were inherently resistant to change. When disturbed by either internal or external forces, some counteracting movement developed and they tended to return to their original state. His elitism was reflected in his view of the masses of the body of humanity left over after the elite had been subtracted. Quote, the incompetent, those lacking energy, character, and intelligence, end quote. Just as most conduct was in a residual non-logical category once the logical had been subtracted. An intriguing aspect of Pareto's work was his analysis of the role of strategy in political systems. This was not quite how he phrased the issue, but it is a reasonable decoding of the rather idiosyncratic language he adopted, notably in his most important work, the 4-volume study published in English as The Mind and Society. Rather than talk of strategy, Pareto preferred to logical conduct. This was essentially procedural rationality. Action should be oriented to an attainable goal using means appropriate to that goal. In his terminology, that would mean that the objective end, what was achieved, and the subjective purpose, what was intended, would be identical. This set a very high standard for logicality. With non-logical conduct, by contrast, objective ends and subjective purposes would diverge. Here, either action lacked purpose, or the claimed purpose was out of reach or could not be attained by the methods employed. Not surprisingly, he found this to be common. Examples of non-logical conduct might be the practice of magic, reliance on superstition, dependence on routine, yearnings for utopias, and exaggerated confidence in the competence of individuals and organizations or in the effectiveness of particular tactics. Pareto saw the roots of non-logical action in residues, what is left over when the logical is taken away. These were constant instinctive factors influencing behavior, while derivations changed over time and space. The analysis of residues began in the second of a 4-volume work and soon became extraordinarily discursive and complicated. Well into volume 4, the previous 6 residues were effectively reduced to 2, and these were shown to match Machiavelli's distinction between lions and foxes as representatives of force and guile. The residue associated with foxes, Pareto's Class 1, reflected the instinct of combinations, the impulse to make connections between disparate elements and events, to think imaginatively, encourage attempts to outwit others, maneuver out of trouble, generate ideologies, and form expedient coalitions. By contrast, Class 2 residues, those associated with lions, reflected the persistence of aggregates, referred to tendencies to consolidate established positions, instincts for permanence, stability, and order. The lions would demonstrate an attachment to family, class, nation, and religion, and make their appeals to solidarity, order, discipline, property, or family. Pareto associated lions with a greater readiness to use force. Although the lions seemed to be more conservative and foxes more radical, this was not necessarily the case. In Pareto's terminology, ideology was a derivation, and thus a rationalization for something deeper. Force might be used to protect the status quo as well as to overthrow it. In this way, Pareto represented as residues the two poles of classical strategy, force and guile, one involving problems with physical strength and the other with brain power. Pareto did not present these characteristics as matters of degree, but as distinctive and exclusive types. The elite was more likely to be composed of intelligent foxes, maintaining their position through cunning and deceit, with the more stolid and unimaginative lions found among the masses, bound by a sense of group loyalty. Foxes would seek to govern through consent, and so would devise ideologies to keep the masses satisfied and seek short-term fixes to crises rather than use force. Here lay the vulnerability of the foxes. Their readiness to compromise and squeamishness when it came to using force would weaken the regime. At some point their maneuvers would no longer work, and they would face hard opponents who could no longer be outwitted. When the more tough-minded lions governed, they tended to rely on force and would be uninterested in compromise, claiming to be defending higher values. As neither group would endure on its own, the most stable regime would have a mixture of both types. In practice, each would tend to recruit their own kind. Fox regimes would degenerate over time and become vulnerable to a sudden show of force. Lion regimes would more likely be infiltrated by foxes and would thus experience more gradual decline. Out of all this, Pareto postulated the circulation of elites. There was always an elite, but it could change in composition. The advantage should be with the shrewd and the cunning, but not to the point where violence could never be advised. The idea that political history can be viewed as a dialectic between practitioners of force and guile had a certain appeal, but Pareto was generalizing out of his own political context, reflecting his skepticism of democratic claims and distaste for the corrupt and cynical politics of his time, and then looking for historical parallels to bolster his theory, playing down the impact of material changes and the growing importance of bureaucratic organization. This did not, as we shall see, prevent his ideas from influencing conservative circles as they looked for intellectually robust alternatives to socialism and Marx.